Gnosticism, which arose in both Syria and North Africa. In the first century, within the first 30 or 40 years of the Christian era, had one peculiar disadvantage from the beginning. It was never a completely united system. Gnosticism was always at least a three-pronged instrument. Gnosticism was broken up at a very early period into sects. In fact, what we know as Gnosticism altogether is practically a union of sects initially divided. Thus, instead of having a system strong around a central core or a central teacher or a central leader, we have a dozen or more groups with various backgrounds and various religious doctrines with which they were attempting to create the Gnostic position. We know the word Gnostic from gnosis, to know. It was a search for knowledge, but essentially the Gnostic was a religionist. Instead of being a scientist, he was a theologian. He was attempting the same principle that dominated the Hermetic philosopher, but he was working upon an entirely different concept, namely that through the extensive interpretation of, clarification of, the theological and religious structure of the time, he would find the true, actual, eternal, and universal faith. That he would come into possession of the true religion, the one religion. Early in his experience, therefore, by the very diversity of his background, the Gnostic began to be a student of comparative religion. He began to think not of one faith alone, but of many faiths. And in the schools of Gnosticism, there were followers of many beliefs and many religious systems. The only answer to this, therefore, was the recognition of the unities underlying spiritual revelation. The Gnostic believed in revelation. He believed that the final source of knowledge was the power or grace of God bestowed upon him, so that he might know as an inner or spiritual certainty those things which could not be comprehended by the intellect. Therefore, he practiced visions. He practiced certain forms of magical rites and ceremonies. He invoked deities, and he sought to gain the intercession of divine powers and the advancement of his material state, or the continuance of his spiritual growth. Now, the Gnosis moved toward Christianity, and Christianity certainly enveloped phases of the Gnosis. But there was always a conflict there that could not be completely reconciled, the nearest point of reconciliation being in the works of Paul. In Gnosticism, for example, the principle of redemption was an eternal principle, ever functioning. The principle of redemption in Gnosticism was unhistorical. It was known to the first man, and it would be known to the last man, because redemption was an attribute of eternal deity itself. Redemption, therefore, did not center upon any historical time or historical person. Gradually, in the Christian Gnosis, an effort was made to apply this redemptive principle exclusively to the person of Jesus. The Gnostics made a valiant attempt at this, but when you look in perspective over 18 or 1900 years, the patchwork, the tragic difficulties which their philosophy or religion passed through in this effort to combine itself with another doctrine, these difficulties become increasingly apparent. The historical redemption concept was not Gnostic, and the Gnostics who attempted to follow it did so with a good spirit and a good heart, but never consistent with their own original teaching. Thus, Gnosticism was a religion seeking a universal experience of God. It was a little bit in the feeling of the teachings of Akhenaton. It was this sudden bursting forth of the realization that there was only one God, and that this one God was the God of the friend and the enemy, the God of races and nations, and had an existence beyond all attributes, all terms, and all names that could be bestowed upon this divine principle. Immediately, the Gnostic deity begins to emerge, and we are in the presence of a universal, eternal, unchangeable principle of mystery. Mystery, however, which is penetrated primarily through religion. A mystery which is approached by utter humility and complete devotion, seeking always that mysterious hour which no man knoweth, the hour when the grace of God shall richly descend upon the individual.
The Gnostics did not confine their studies or their teachings to any one religion, but borrowed illustrations from all that were accessible to them. This caused them to be considered Christians, heretics, Jews who were trying to undermine Christianity, remnants of the Persian sun worshippers. They have been widely studied by early Christian sages, and it is upon the opinions of these latter that many conclusions have been formed. Little or no investigation of these, quote, people of wisdom, unquote, has been done by research workers on the spot in Asia and North Africa, where strong and interesting traces of their beliefs and practices still remain. The main teaching states that there is a supreme being or power which is invisible and has no perceptible form. It is pantheism. This power is the one which can be contacted by mankind, and it is through it that man can control himself and work out his destiny. The various religious teachers through the ages, putting their creeds in many different ways, were in contact with this power they claim, and the religions all contain a more or less hidden kernel of initiation. Now, this is the secret which the knowers can communicate to their disciples. But the secret can be acquired only through exercising the mind and body until the terrestrial man is so refined as to be able to become a vehicle for the use of this power, or, in their terms, illumined. Eventually, the initiate becomes identified with the power, and in the end he attains his true destiny as purified personality, infinitely superior to the rest of unenlightened mankind, to the state of apotheosis, where he himself is God. The symbolism in which this teaching is concealed, the methods by which the mystical power is attained, vary from one Gnostic society to another, but the constant factor is there: the attainment of that which humankind unconsciously needs. You see, the Gnostic claims that within every man and woman there is an unfulfilled urge which cannot be given any proper expression in the normal way, because there is no social means by which it can be fulfilled. What were and are the Gnostic practices? Well, first, discipleship, and the inculcated belief that the initiate must struggle, must devote himself as much as possible to the identification with the power which inspires all. Secondly, there are two kinds of men: those who are bound to the earth and to matter, and those who can refine themselves. It is from the latter class that aspirants are chosen. They claim. In every instance that we've investigated, they may choose them from the latter class, but they all end up in the first. Ethically speaking, Gnostic belief is that there are two principles, that of good and evil. A balance must be struck between these forces, and the balance is in the hands of the Gnostic, the knower, partly because nobody else can tell whether an action is for the eventual good of the individual or the community. And this secret knowledge comes through the mystical insight which the supermen Gnostics attained. There's that reference to a super race or a superman again, which always crops up with these people, as it did with Hitler and many others. The rise of individuals who wrongly believed that they had attained to gnosis, all knowledge, some of whom were leaders of Gnostic societies, produced very notorious characters. Those who followed the way of the Ophite branch glorified the serpent who tempted Eve, and they still do that today. They did this because this snake, by his actions, brought knowledge into the world, gave man the gift of intellect, the use of which will bring him to the state of apotheosis, where man himself will be God. Basilides was a leader who taught that Jesus did not die on the cross, and you will see this crop up all through the history of the mystery schools, even in the Knights Templar. Since matter and material things were considered to be a part of the inferior non-spiritual world, the sect known as the Cainites called upon everyone to destroy those things which belonged to the world, and they called themselves the Destroyers, and their god is the Destroyer.
Gnosticism assumed or expounded what is called Emanationism. This Emanationism is of Platonic origin, but its relation to Plato gradually vanished as a factor in thinking. This Emanationism is to the effect that as this resplendent and magnificent divine power, perfect and effulgent in all its parts, is the radiant core, source, and heart of things, its radiance extending outward forms a kind of halo or nimbus. And this first brilliant nimbus surrounding the mysterious, unknowable core of things, the Gnostics called nous, or mind. They declared, therefore, that mind was the revelation of that which was beyond the mind and above mind, and that the creative works of the world were accomplished by a mind suspended from a consciousness, that this mind was subservient to that consciousness, and that this mind ultimately returned to that consciousness, either in the form of the individual mind or in the collective universal mind. Then this effulgency, continuing to radiate outward, like the streamers of the corona of the sun, gradually radiated further and further into darkness. And as it radiated, it became weaker and more diffused, until these emanations of light became less and less powerful, and were ultimately absorbed, dissolved, or eaten up by the darkness of space. Therefore, imperfection constitutes that part of existence or creation in which the rays of the central consciousness are not strong enough to control or to blaze through and reveal themselves. And the absolute circumference of existence is matter. And matter is that part of life in which the light has been absorbed until it is no longer obvious or apparent. The Gnostics, being essentially dualists, then affirmed that what we call matter is essentially the principle of evil. That evil is this darkness. Evil is the victory of space over spirit. This victory is the inertia, which is at the extreme circumference of action. It is not a central inertia, but a circumference inertia, in which, as Plato points out, if you stand close to the light of the candle, you can read the book. But if you are 20 feet from the light of the candle, you can no longer read the book, because the light is not strong enough. In the same way, if we stand close to the nous, or the source of light, we can read the book of life. But if we are far removed from it, the light is not strong enough, and we cannot read. And the minds and bodies of men, having dissolved and absorbed this light into themselves, it is no longer available for immediate purpose of illumination.